Along the eastern borders of Europe, an immense forest stood frozen in the darkness, engines idling, men gripping rifles, officers checking watches by faint torchlight somewhere in the distance. Artillery crews waited beside their guns, unaware that within hours they would unleash a storm that would reshape the world. There would be no declaration of war, no final warning. At dawn, history would change forever. Less than 2 years earlier, the world had been stunned by an alliance that seemed impossible. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies sworn to destroy one another, had signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it promised peace between Berlin and Moscow. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was marked for destruction, and when the moment came, it was crushed from both sides. For Stalin, the pact bought time. For Hitler, it bought freedom. To wage war in the West without fear of a second front. Throughout 1940, German power appeared unstoppable. Blitzkrieg shattered the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with breathtaking speed. Paris fell, Britain stood alone. To many observers, Germany seemed invincible. But while Europe watched the drama unfold in the West, Hitler's true ambitions lay far beyond the borders of France. From the earliest days of his ideology, Hitler believed Germany's destiny was in the East. The Soviet Union was not merely a rival power, it was, in Nazi doctrine, an existential enemy. Its destruction was framed as both a racial and ideological crusade. Slavic populations were deemed inferior, their lands to be seized, their labor exploited, their culture erased. Bolshevism, portrayed as a Jewish conspiracy, was to be annihilated. The war that Hitler envisioned was not one of negotiation or compromise, it was a war of annihilation. In December 1940, Hitler formalized his intentions. Führer Directive 21 outlined the plan for Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a symbol of imperial conquest. The directive assumed that the Soviet Union would collapse after a short campaign. German forces would advance deep into Soviet territory, destroy the Red Army near the border, and force the state to disintegrate before winter arrived. The campaign was expected to last weeks, not months. On June 22, 1941, the illusion of peace ended. At first light, artillery thundered across an 1,800-mile front. German troops surged forward alongside allies from across Europe. It was the largest military invasion ever launched. Over 3.5 million soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured into Soviet territory. The Luftwaffe struck first, obliterating Soviet airfields and destroying nearly 2,000 aircraft in a single day. The Red Army, stunned and disorganized, reeled under the assault. German panzer divisions drove forward with terrifying speed. Entire Soviet formations were encircled and annihilated. At Minsk, Smolensk, and later Kiev, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles. To German commanders, it appeared that the enemy was collapsing exactly as predicted. Yet beneath the surface, the situation was more complex. The Soviet Union was vast beyond German comprehension. Distances swallowed divisions, roads dissolved into dust or mud, railways had to be rebuilt to accommodate German trains, fuel shortages became routine. Every mile eastward stretched supply lines thinner and thinner. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance stiffened. Units destroyed one week were replaced by new formations the next. Losses that would have shattered any Western army were absorbed by sheer numbers and relentless mobilization. As summer gave way to autumn, Hitler intervened personally in the campaign. Rather than focusing on Moscow, he redirected armored forces north toward Leningrad and south toward Ukraine. His generals protested. Moscow, they argued, was the nerve center of Soviet power. But Hitler believed that capturing resources and destroying Soviet armies mattered more than seizing the capital. The diversion produced enormous tactical victories. Near Kiev, one of the largest encirclements in history, resulted in more than 600,000 Soviet casualties. But the strategic cost was time the Germans could not afford to lose. By the time the advance on Moscow resumed, the weather turned hostile. Autumn rains transformed roads into rivers of mud, immobilizing vehicles and exhausting troops. Then came the cold. Temperatures plunged far earlier than expected. Engines froze, weapons malfunctioned. German soldiers, still lacking proper winter equipment, suffered terribly. While the Germans struggled, The Soviet Union endured. Factories were dismantled and transported east beyond the reach of German bombers. New tanks and aircraft were produced in staggering numbers. The T-34 tank, with its sloped armor and powerful gun, shocked German forces when it appeared on the battlefield. Siberian divisions, trained for winter warfare, were redeployed westward. In October 1941, Germany launched Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow. Once again, massive encirclements destroyed hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. For a moment, it seemed victory was still possible. German units advanced to within sight of the Kremlin. Reconnaissance patrols reached the outskirts of the city. But they could go no further. Exhausted, freezing, and undersupplied, the German army stalled. On December 5, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. German lines collapsed. Hitler ordered his troops to stand fast, dismissing generals who urged retreat. The result was disaster. German forces were pushed back hundreds of miles. The myth of blitzkrieg invincibility was shattered. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The reasons were fundamental. German planning was based on fantasy rather than reality. Soviet manpower, industrial capacity, and resilience were catastrophically underestimated. Logistics collapsed under the weight of distance and weather. Hitler's interference fractured strategic focus. Above all, the German leadership failed to understand the nature of the war they had unleashed. This was not France. This was not a campaign that could be won in weeks. It was a war of endurance, and Germany was not prepared for it. Yet the war did not end in 1941. In 1942, Hitler launched another massive offensive toward the Caucasus and the oil fields beyond. Once again, German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory. Once again, early victories masked deeper weaknesses. And once again, the vastness of the land and the resilience of the defenders took their toll. The road east led not to triumph, but to Stalingrad, to collapse, and ultimately to defeat. Operation Barbarossa marked the moment when Nazi Germany crossed a point of no return. What began as a lightning strike became a grinding war of attrition that consumed entire armies. The invasion awakened the full power of the Soviet Union and ensured that the war in Europe would end not with negotiation, but with total destruction. In the frozen fields outside Moscow, the German advance stopped, and in that moment, though few realized it at the time, the fate of the Third Reich was sealed.